What's up, you freaking geniuses? So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to evaluate even and odd trig functions, right? So as you can see, I have all the even and odd trig identities written up here, right? We have cosine and then the reciprocal function of cosine, the secant, so those are paired together, sine and cosecant, and tangent and cotangent, right? Just so you know, cosine and secant are even trig functions, and these other four are odd. So for these, to do these problems anyways, that's not super important just because you'll basically see that the process is the same for all of them. So let's start with this first example right here. So first we're given that the sine of t is equal to positive 1/2. Okay, and just so you know, sometimes instead of t we'll use theta or x or some other variable, but they all basically mean the same thing, all right? So these are the two trig functions that we want to evaluate, sine of negative t and cosecant of negative t. So starting with sine of negative t, what do we know about this function? Well, luckily it's the exact one that it gives us up here in the trig identity, right? So it says the sine of negative t is equal to the negative sine of t. All right, so let's just write that down. So the sine of negative t is equal to the negative sine of t. All right, so what is the sine of t? Well, luckily, we're given that, right? It says the sine of t is equal to positive 1/2. So the sine of negative t is going to be equal to negative sine of t, which again we said is 1/2. So we'll plug in a 1/2 for the sine of t right here. So we get that the sine of negative t is simply equal to negative 1/2. Okay, great. Now let's go on to the next one. So this time we want to evaluate the cosecant of negative t. All right, so that's going to be the reciprocal of sine, right? So here it says that the cosecant of negative t is equal to the negative cosecant of t. So one thing that would first be helpful is simply finding what the cosecant of t is. Okay, and the reason this would be helpful is because, like we said, sine and cosecant are reciprocals of one another, right? So, for instance, if the sine of t, right, that's the problem we were given, it's telling us that the sine of t is equal to 1/2. So that means the cosecant of t is going to be equal to 2/1, right? These two are reciprocals. So that is actually pretty helpful now because we can use this little bit of information right here to now find, again, this cosecant of negative t, right? So let's write out what the trig identity tells us here. So it says, again, that the cosecant of negative t, which is what we're looking for, is equal to the negative cosecant t, right? It's equal to the negative cosecant t. And now we know what the cosecant of t is, right? It's equal to 2/1, or simply we could write that as 2, right? So then here we get that the cosecant of negative t is equal to negative, and then again, for cosecant t, we're going to plug in a 2, right? So we're going to plug in a 2 right there. So here we get that the cosecant of negative t is equal to simply -2. All right, now for this next example, we're given that the cosine of negative t is equal to -1/5. And then these are the two trig functions that we're looking for. So the cosine of t and the secant of negative t. Okay, so let's start with this first one on the left. Let's find the cosine of just t, right? Positive t. So the trig identity here tells us that the cosine of negative t is equal to the positive cosine of t, right? So let's just write that out for reference. So the cosine of negative t is equal to the cosine of t. Well, in this case, we already know what the cosine of negative t is, right? Because it literally tells us right here. It says that it's equal to -1/5. So let's plug in a -1/5 right here for the cosine of negative t. So -1/5. And the identity tells us that this thing is equal to the cosine of t, which is exactly what we're looking for, right? So we'll just put the cosine of t right there. Right? So here we get that the cosine of t is equal to simply -1/5. All right, now let's go to the next one. So here we're looking for the secant of negative t. So there's a couple different ways we could solve this, but I'm going to just try and keep it consistent here. So again, the first thing that we can remember is that the secant and the cosine functions are reciprocals of one another, right? So as you can see here, we already figured out what the cosine of t is, right? The cosine of t is equal to negative 1/5. So that means the secant of t, let's just write it up here, the secant of t must be equal to negative 5/1, all right? So the sign still stays the same, right? This is negative, so this still stays negative. The only thing that flips is the fraction, right? So in any case, the secant of t is equal to negative 5/1, or simply we could write that as negative 5, right? So now that we know what the secant of t is, right, negative 5, now let's figure out what the secant of negative t is. So let's use our identity right here that tells us, let's write it over here, the secant of negative t is equal to secant of t. Secant of t. All right, so secant of negative t, right, that's what we're looking for, and it's saying that it's equal to the secant of t, which we just found right up here, right? It's equal to negative 5. So the secant of negative t is equal to negative 5. All right, just a couple more here. So this time we're given the sine of t is equal to positive 4/5, and this time we're asked to evaluate the sine of pi minus t and the sine of t plus pi. All right, so there's two other identities that we need to go over, but they're actually fairly straightforward, okay? So let's start with the sine of pi minus t. So here you can see we have the sine of pi minus t. When you're given that, it's going to be equal to simply the sine of t, all right? So this thing is equal to simply the sine of t. And as you can see, we are already given what the sine of t is equal to, right? Positive 4/5. So that means this thing right here is simply equal to positive 4/5, right? It's actually not too bad. So now let's go to the next one. So now we have the sine of t plus pi. Okay, so that one's slightly different, right? The sine of t plus pi is equal to the negative sine of t, all right? So this whole thing, again, is equal to the negative sine of t. Well, we know what the sine of t is equal to, right? That's given, it's equal to 4/5. So this whole thing is simply equal to negative, right? Negative sine of t, which is 4/5. So this whole thing is equal to negative 4/5. All right, now lastly, let's go over this one. So this time we have the cosine of t is equal to 4/5. And this time we're going to find the cosine of pi minus t and the cosine of t plus pi. So starting with this one, the cosine of pi minus t. Let's see. The cosine of pi minus t, it's the one up here on top, is equal to the negative cosine of t. So this thing is equal to the negative cosine of t. And of course, we're already given the cosine of t is equal to 4/5. So let's plug in a 4/5 for this cosine of t right there. And again, it's negative, all right? So the cosine of pi minus t is equal to simply negative 4/5. Okay, now here we're given the cosine again of t plus pi, all right? So that's going to be this one down here. The cosine of t plus pi is also equal to the negative cosine of t, all right? So they're both going to be equal to the exact same thing, all right? So here, if we got negative 4/5, then that means this one is also going to be equal to negative 4/5. Boom. So if you found the video helpful, make sure to leave a thumbs up down below. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below.